Hi, I'm Brenda Clews, and I'm going to interview John Oughton on his new novel, Death by Triangulation, which was published by
Neo-Poesis Press out in the West Coast.
This year, 2015.
July.
And you've had 5 books of poetry published. The most recent was Time Slip with Guernica in 2010. So now you publish regularly, and yet you're writing a novel, which is really interesting to dive into another form. So I'm just curious about what the seed was that would cause you to consider writing in a form you don't normally write in. And then how did the novel kind of flesh out around that motivation or inspiration? Was there an inspiration, or?
Okay, well, that's a few questions, but I wanted a challenge. I feel it's easy as a writer to kind of slip into a groove of writing the way you're used to writing, and also poetry is a pretty small audience. I published, as you said, 5 books, and when the 5th book came out, it was kind of a collected works, yet I had to work to get readings. It got 1 review. It's a very small stone in the pond of culture, so more people like fiction than like poetry, I think it's safe to say. So there's a bigger audience. I wanted to try something different, and also I guess the seed of it was to come up with a private investigator who had something different, something to set him off from all the other fictional ones. And because I was putting my fair amount of myself into the character, that something else was culture, his knowledge of art and literature and his interest in taking on cases that other detectives would find too weird or too obscure or, too symbolic or whatever. That's what he's good at. So I think that's kind of what got it going, is finding something for him to do where the clues were literary and symbolic and other people were confused by it, but he was willing to live with confusion and try to find some stuff out.
Yeah, I found, it was like every part of the puzzle that he unwinds or finds is almost like a cryptic poem to begin with. And in a way, the different clues and the different discoveries are like figuring out a really difficult metaphor in an obscure poem. Mm-hmm. So in some way, I do find the structure of the novel is, although it's a narrative, actually is quite poem-like. And I found that really interesting. He is a poet detective. Yes. Who rides a motorcycle. Mm-hmm. And is asked by a wealthy family, to find out why
their black sheep uncle died, but more importantly, was he sitting on any scandals that might be released after his death and would hurt the family name. So he's up there both to find out what happened and to suppress anything that would be to the discredit of the family, unless it's illegal to do so, of course.
But you get the feeling the family knew there was something.
Well, the old guy left a lot of hints. Yeah. I would say so. And I like what you said about how it's, structured more like a poem. It's not surprising given that's my experience. But I found the real challenge as a writer was to create the plot the right way, to have the clues, to build suspense, to tell the reader something but not too much. That's where I think I, really had to learn while doing this novel.
I still found the narrative, it moved like metaphors encased in other metaphors. I mean, I remember the birdhouses and thinking they are really like a poetic image. Mm-hmm. It comes onto the horizon, it's mentioned in a conversation, And as the protagonist, moves into the house and starts to explore the birdhouses, and then discovers perhaps some of them have contained secrets or not, and there was a kind of poetic mystery throughout that I really enjoyed, and that I found quite different to most, say, poetic narratives. There are writers whose writing is almost a poetry in prose, and they'll write a novel, whereas with Death by Triangulation, I found the writing more kind of poet street talk.
Yeah.
But that the way the narrative was structured, it wasn't a linear line at all. And things are discovered in other things. Mm-hmm. So it's like stanzas almost, the house is a poem, and then within that there's, the different things that go on in that house. Anyway, I did find that was particularly appealing to me. But one of my biggest questions is, why an American story?
I wanted him to stumble onto a really big conspiracy and something that he would have serious doubts about whether he should pursue this further or not. And it's hard for me to think of one in Canada of that scale. We've generally had a more peaceful, history than the Americans. Certainly we've had a fair amount of violence and genocide of the natives populations at times and so on, but we haven't had as many, we never had a civil war, for example, the way they did in the States. We haven't assassinated our prime ministers the way they knock off presidents. So I think that's what drew me to it, was I wanted something large and that people with a lot of power would be behind.
So you must have done a massive amount of research.
A fair amount. I already knew some of the backstory I wanted to use, but I did want to make sure that the details I included that related to history were as accurate as possible.
It bizarrely fits. I mean, it does. Not that I've ever really followed all the conspiracy theories, but to me this is very clever. I wonder. It took you 5 years to write.
Yes.
And you carried it around in a laptop, or?
In various forms, yeah, mostly a laptop. I wrote some in the Dominican Republic. I wrote some at a retreat on the Toronto Islands, one of the artscape spaces, and some of it up in Prince Edward County. So, yeah, it had to be kind of assembled bit by bit, but I kept at it. It had enough momentum that I knew it was going to finish at some point, and it did.
So did you write it in a linear way, or did you write bits and then go back and write other bits? And did you know the ending?
Yeah.
Did you know the ending when you began?
No, I didn't.
See, now that's poetry. You don't know where the poem's going, whereas fiction, the author tends to have some idea of what the outcome will be and works towards that.
Right.
So at what point in writing it did the outcome come to you?
Probably about halfway through it. Once I started giving him the clues as to what the conspiracy actually was, and once people started to get more active trying to suppress his efforts to investigate, I figured, well, from here on there's really only one way. He's going to figure it out, and then he has to decide, does he let the world know about this or not, and if so, what's going to influence his decision. And then I wouldn't say the rest wrote itself, because finishing it was the hardest part. I couldn't figure out what would be a good ending, and I wrestled with a few, but that's what led to it.
I think the ending works.
Good.
The ending does wrap it up quite well. It doesn't leave any ends kind of hanging there, really. But one of the responses to Death by Triangulation is people are asking for a sequel with Aaron. What's his?
Aaron Miles.
Yeah, I got that.
Aaron Miles is his nickname.
Yeah, people are already asking for, or suggesting that Aaron Miles, might have some other adventures. And he might follow, other clues that come in poems or
Right.
whatever.
It would have something to do with art and culture and mysteries. But yeah, I think I probably will write another one, and maybe this time it will be not so much politics, but music or photography or something. But it's got to have some weight behind it,
Do you have an idea for a murder mystery?
Oh, I've got a few. And, there's always lots of dirt and sex and violence under the surface of the cultural scene.
So you may have begun a new career as not just a one-novel poet, but a series of detective of a poet detective.
Mm-hmm.
You also ride a motorbike.
Yes.
And we've got some footage of you with an iPhone taped to your helmet.
Yes.
Driving from
Bloomfield to Picton.
which is kind of fun. I enjoyed the footage. And I'd like you to read a section from the novel. The section I picked is actually less narrative and more poetry. But it's not a poetic writing. It's quite beautiful, and I think it goes quite well with
So the sequence I'm about to read you is in the kind of the latter third of the novel. Our hero, Aaron Miles, is being taken for a glider ride by an elderly American guy, an expatriate who settled in the county named Harlan. And Harlan used to work for the CIA and knows a thing or two about the conspiracy that Aaron is circling around. He's also a glider pilot, and he's very suspicious of being recorded or of other people hearing what he's going to tell Aaron, so that he insists that they go up together in a glider after he's carefully checked that Aaron is not carrying any recording devices, doesn't have a microphone hidden up his wazoo or a camera up his sleeve or anything like that. So the sequence I'm going to read you begins with them being set up to tow the glider along the runway at the old airport at the top of Picton on Macaulay Mountain. The canopy was snugged in place and the rope reattached. The tow plane crept forward until the line was taut. The couple each took a wing of the glider. The tow plane started to roll, and the couple ran alongside, keeping our wingtips in the air, while the glider balanced on its single wheel. Soon they let go, and although the wings wobbled slightly, nothing scraped. To my surprise, the glider rose in the air before the tow plane. I realized this made sense. With its long wings and low weight, a glider would not need as much takeoff speed as a heavier tow plane with its relatively stumpy wings. Harlan did an impressive job of keeping the glider skimming the runway, just a few feet up. Obviously, he didn't want to get far above the tow plane at this delicate moment, or something might go awry. Finally, the tow plane labored into the air, and then the airport shrank below us. Harlan kept the glider a little higher than the tow plane, the tow rope taut. It was comforting to see that he knew what he was doing. Our airborne tractor made a few lazy circles, gaining altitude, until I felt the glider suddenly lift as if we caught an updraft coming up the side of the mountain. Harlan warned the other pilot of his intentions, then released the tow rope. Suddenly, we rose and cut to the right. The tow plane went down and left, waggling its wings in a brief salute. Harlan's voice cracked over the intercom. "Give me a minute to gain some altitude, and then we'll talk." "Okay," I replied. It was noisier than I expected. The wind rushed and whistled. The structure of the plane creaked and flexed. It was cool in the unheated cockpit, but not uncomfortable, and I found the patchwork view of fields and roads below fascinating. As we rose, I could see several lakes, the reaches of Lake Ontario that surrounded the county, then Lake on the Mountain. In the wavering distance was the long shape of what must be Lake Consacon. The altimeter kept winding up. The variometer went between plus and minus as we encountered invisible columns of airflow. And the compass swung as we circled and soared. Harlan's voice woke me from my reverie. "I'll tell you the story now. Don't interrupt. You can ask me questions once I'm done, but I won't guarantee to answer them. You've probably guessed by now that if you tell anyone what I'm about to relate, I'll deny ever having said it. I'm just giving you a little glider lesson. Got that? I said I had. Now grasp the stick in front of you and push it gently forward. I did so, finding more resistance than I'd expected. The glider's nose dipped and we gained speed. Now center the stick and then hold it to the left. At the same time, push the left rudder pedal. As I followed his instructions, there was little response. I applied more pressure and the plane banked to the left and started to turn. I held the turn until we got 180 degrees around, then, somewhat clumsily, brought us back to level flight. I decided that I liked gliding. It was quieter than motorcycling, satisfying in a different way. Both experiences included the pleasure of banking, leaning far into turns as the world tilted below. But a bike is always ruled by the growling urgency of its engine. A glider is in stealth mode, like sailing. You read the whims of invisible currents of air and compromise between where you want to go and what the conditions will allow. Not too shabby for a biker, Harlan said. Now, I don't have to lie about giving you a lesson. Release the controls and I'll talk.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to say or mention or talk about that hasn't been touched in this interview that?
What I hope readers would find in this that's different from other mystery novels. First of all, I think there's some humor. I didn't want it to be deadly serious, and our hero has a sort of lively inner life and makes snarky comments, sometimes about himself, but sometimes about other people or situations as well. And I hope that people find the interweaving of the cultural themes in it, the fact that a poem is a clue to the mystery, that the old guy who was shot off his lawn tractor was a writer, and that people kind of take this for granted. Being active in literature, culture is not some exotic thing, it's just another thing that people do.
Yeah.
Okay,
well, that was great. Death by Triangulation by John Oughton. It's in the library system?
It's in the Toronto Public Library System. 5 copies.
Five copies in the Toronto Public Library System, and it's definitely well worth reading. It's very well written. It is a good whodunit, and the plot goes in twists and turns that will surprise you, even if you are a mystery genre aficionado.
Thank you, Brenda. I should get you to write the blurb for my next book. This Blenda is by blurb.